The pack offered Omega as sacrifice to a cursed wolf. The betrayed Alpha King returned. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Elena Moore had learned early that silence could be safer than hope, and on the night Ravenfall prepared its oldest rite, silence pressed against her like a winter coat that never quite fit, heavy at the shoulders and tight at the throat. The pack grounds stretched under a pale moon, lanterns flickering in careful rows measured 10 yards apart, each flame steady, as if trained not to tremble, and the air carried the clean scent of pine and cold stone that told her the season had turned. Elena stood at the edge, hands folded, eyes forward, her posture calm enough to pass for acceptance, though her heart counted every second the way a clock counts down. Ravenfall had prospered by rules written long before anyone remembered who wrote them, rules spoken softly and obeyed loudly. And tonight those rules asked for an offering to appease what the elders called the cursed wolf beyond the ridge. They said the forest there bent time, that shadows listened, that the wind carried answers if you knew how to wait. And Elena waited while the council gathered beneath the tallest oak, faces pale, voices low, measuring words the way one measures inches on a ruler. She was an Omega, unclaimed and unnoticed, useful only in ways that never earned a name. And when the announcement came, it felt less like a sentence and more like a fact, the kind of fact you nod at because arguing would only draw attention. The elders did not shout her name. They let it fall, soft and final, as if gravity itself had chosen. Around her, wolves shifted their weight, boots scuffing the packed earth by a few inches, eyes sliding away to lantern glass or the distant tree line, anywhere but her face. And Elena felt the quiet agreement of a crowd that had already moved on. The rite would begin at midnight, they said, and until then there would be preparation, a word that meant stripping her of symbols and stories until only the role remained. Elena did not plead, because pleading suggested an audience, and there was none. She breathed, steady and slow, and thought of the small comforts she could carry without permission, the way frost sparkled on needles, the way moonlight measured distance in silver yards, the way calm could be a choice even when choices were gone. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the forest waited, and with it the truth of a curse spoken by those who had never stood close enough to listen. Elena lifted her chin, not in defiance but in balance, and took one step forward as the lanterns dimmed, carrying with her the quiet resolve of someone who understood that endings were often doorways in disguise. The preparations began without ceremony, because ceremony would have implied dignity, and Elena Moore was given none of that, only a quiet efficiency that treated her like an item already accounted for. 2 attendants guided her along a stone path measured in careful steps, their voices low and neutral, explaining what would happen as if reciting weather, and Elena listened without interruption, noting the distance by the rhythm of her breath and the way the lantern light thinned as they moved away from the central grounds. She was brought to a small clearing where a wooden table waited, bare except for a folded cloak the color of ash, and an elder read the words that severed her from Ravenfall, not unkindly, simply thoroughly, naming the privileges she no longer held and the protections she would not receive. Elena stood still, shoulders square, as symbols were removed with polite hands, a pin unclasped, a cord untied, each motion light enough to suggest mercy, heavy enough to be final. When the elder finished, there was a pause, the kind that invited grief to speak, and Elena let it pass, because grief was a private language and she did not owe it an audience. She accepted the cloak and draped it around herself, the fabric cool and rough, grounding her in the present as the wind shifted and carried the scent of the ridge, sharper now, like rain on stone. The pack did not follow her far. Tradition required distance, and distance was the easiest promise to keep. She walked alone along a trail that narrowed to a line no wider than a yard, the forest rising on both sides, branches knitting a ceiling that filtered moonlight into thin bands, and with each step she felt the quiet weight of being unseen, a sensation she knew well. Time moved differently there, stretching and compressing like breath held too long, and Elena counted her steps in groups of 10 to keep her pace steady, thinking of small things she could control, the way her boots pressed into soil, the way the night cooled her cheeks, the way fear could exist without commanding her. When the path ended, it did not announce itself. It simply opened into a clearing ringed by stones placed with deliberate gaps, wide enough for a person to stand between them, narrow enough to feel guided. At the center lay a flat rock warmed by the day, still holding a trace of heat, and Elena placed her palm against it, surprised by the comfort of something solid that did not judge. She did not call out, because calling assumed an answer, and she did not pray, because prayers asked for change, and tonight required witness. The forest listened anyway, leaves shifting with a sound like distant water, and the air felt attentive, as if the night itself leaned closer by a few feet. Elena sat on the edge of the stone and waited, cloak drawn tight, posture straight, eyes open to the dark, choosing awareness over anticipation. She thought of Ravenfall only once, not with bitterness but with clarity, recognizing the relief beneath the betrayal, the way fear had disguised itself as law, and she released it with a slow breath. Whatever lived beyond the ridge would arrive or it would not, and either way, Elena resolved to meet it as herself, not as a role assigned by others, anchored in the simple truth that presence could be a form of courage when nothing else was left. The night deepened by degrees rather than moments, as if the forest preferred patience, and Elena more felt the shift before she heard it, a subtle change in pressure, like weather turning miles away. The air cooled another few degrees, settling against her skin, and the leaves nearest the stone stilled, not from fear but from attention, as though listening had become a shared act. Elena rose, slow and deliberate, placing her feet shoulder-width apart on the packed earth, grounding herself in balance she could trust, and she waited without calling out, because calling would have framed the moment as a challenge, and she did not come to challenge what had already claimed this place. The sound arrived next, not a growl or a warning, but a measured exhale carried on the wind, steady and controlled, followed by footsteps that did not rush, each one placed with intent a few yards beyond the ring of stones. Elena kept her gaze level, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dark until shapes resolved into lines and depth, and she noticed first the absence of chaos, the way branches did not snap, the way the night did not scatter, the way the clearing held. A presence entered the space, tall and still, its outline defined more by the way moonlight bent around it than by detail, and Elena recognized the discipline of restraint before she recognized anything else. She felt the weight of being seen without being judged, a sensation unfamiliar enough to make her breath catch for half a second before she steadied it again. The presence stopped at the edge of the stones, respecting the boundary with a courtesy that felt older than law, and silence stretched, not empty, but full of unasked questions. Elena spoke then, not to plead or explain, but to anchor herself to truth, her voice calm, and even as she said her name, offering it without expectation. The presence shifted, not closer, not farther, and a voice answered, low and composed, shaped by careful control rather than threat, acknowledging her without claiming her, and the sound of it carried the gravity of memory. Elena listened, noting the cadence, the pauses, the way words were chosen and placed as if each one mattered, and she understood that whatever curse the pack feared had not erased reason here. The moon slipped from behind a veil of cloud, silvering the clearing, and for a brief moment Elena saw a face marked by years rather than savagery, eyes steady, expression restrained, and something like recognition passed between them, quiet and undeniable. He did not cross the stones, and she did not retreat, and in that balance the night seemed to ease, as if a knot had loosened by a fraction of an inch. The voice spoke again, this time naming the boundary and the choice it represented, not demanding compliance, not promising mercy, simply stating what was, and Elena felt the truth of it settle in her chest, like a held note resolving at last. She answered with honesty, explaining why she had come, not as an offering, but as a witness to what fear had made of her pack, and she did not accuse, because accusation would have turned the moment into a rehearsal of old wounds. The presence listened without interruption, and when silence returned it carried a different texture, less sharp, more open, and Elena realized that the story she had been sent to end had just begun to change shape, not through force or fate, but through the simple, dangerous act of being heard. The boundary held, and with it the fragile calm that had settled over the clearing, and Elena more felt the night accept her presence in a way that surprised her, like a door left unlatched rather than thrown open. The man beyond the stones did not advance, yet his attention did not waver, and Elena understood that this was not hesitation but restraint, a discipline learned through loss rather than fear. He spoke again, explaining the rules that governed the space between them, not as commands but as truths shaped by consequence. And Elena listened, measuring the distance by the cadence of his words and the steady rhythm of her own breath. The curse, he said, was not a thing that lunged or roared, but a binding born of broken oaths, a weight that pressed inward, tightening whenever trust was named and withdrawn. And as he spoke, Elena recognized the shape of it, familiar in a way that made her chest ache. She answered with quiet clarity, telling him that Ravenfall had chosen safety over honesty, that tradition had become a mask for fear, and that she had been sent not to heal but to be absent, to make the problem feel solved. The moon climbed higher, marking minutes in pale inches, and the clearing seemed to widen as if granting them a few more yards of understanding. He acknowledged her words without interruption, then offered his own, sharing a history that did not seek pity, only record, a time when leadership had meant listening, when loyalty had been mutual, when the pack had asked for protection and returned it in kind, until the night they chose silence over truth and named him something other than what he was. Elena did not interrupt, because interruption would have broken the careful thread forming between them, and she sensed that the telling mattered as much as the content, that being heard was part of the unbinding he could not complete alone. When he finished, the forest breathed, leaves stirring softly, and Elena felt a subtle easing, like a knot loosened by a single, precise pull. She asked a simple question then, not about danger or escape, but about choice, whether the boundary could change if both sides agreed to stand differently, and the pause that followed felt measured, not uncertain. He considered, eyes lifting to the canopy where moonlight traced silver lines between branches, and answered with honesty, saying that change was possible but not owed, that consent mattered even to curses, that nothing would be taken from her simply because she had been offered. The words settled between them, solid and unexpected, and Elena felt her shoulders lower by an inch, relief arriving quietly rather than all at once. She took a step closer to the stones, stopping well short of crossing, and spoke of her own limits, naming what she could give and what she could not, and the respect in his nod felt like a promise without pressure. Time stretched again, not thin but wide, and the night held them in a shared stillness where fear had less room to echo. Somewhere far off, an owl called, marking the hour, and Elena realized that midnight had passed without ceremony, that the rite had failed simply by being witnessed differently. She remained where she was, present and unclaimed, and understood that the path forward would not be a single stride but a series of measured steps, taken with care, with consent, and with the quiet courage of choosing to stay and listen when leaving would have been easier. The night eased into a softer tension, and Elena more sensed the clearing shift from a place of waiting to a place of choice, the stones no longer marking a boundary so much as an understanding. The man beyond them finally moved, not forward but to the side, angling his body to show he was not closing distance without permission, and spoke her name. Again, carefully, as if testing how it sounded when carried by respect rather than decree. He offered his own then, Lucian Blackwood, not as a title but as a fact, and the way he said it carried the weight of something reclaimed rather than announced. Elena acknowledged him with a nod, the exchange quiet and complete, and felt the night hold steady around them, granting space for the next step. Lucian explained that the curse responded to intention more than presence, tightening when fear was fed and loosening when truth was named, and as he spoke Elena noticed the way the air seemed to warm by a degree or two, the flat stone beneath her retaining heat longer than it should have. She asked if the forest itself was bound to him, and he answered that it listened, that it remembered agreements older than the pack, agreements broken when power chose convenience over care. The moonlight sharpened the edges of the stones, and Elena stepped closer to one, close enough to feel the cool surface through her boot, stopping there to honor the balance they had set. Lucien watched without comment, and the absence of correction felt like trust offered without demand. She told him she would stay through the night, not as an offering, but as company, to witness and be witnessed, and he accepted with a measured breath, the smallest easing at the corners of his eyes signaling a shift she felt more than saw. They spoke then of practical things, of distance and rest, of how the forest could carry sound farther than expected, of where she could sit without disrupting the space that held him, and each detail placed another brick in a bridge neither of them rushed to cross. Time passed in quiet increments, measured by the slow travel of moonlight across the clearing and the steady rhythm of Elena's breathing as she settled on the edge of the stone again, cloak drawn around her shoulders. Lucien remained near the trees, present without looming, and when he spoke it was to share memories shaped like weather rather than wounds. The first snowfall he remembered as a boy, the way leadership once meant walking the perimeter at dawn to greet those who rose early, the sound of laughter that used to live where silence now took residence. Elena listened, offering nothing but attention, and felt the curse respond to that simple exchange, a pressure lifting enough to be noticeable, like a door opened an inch to let light test the room. She shared her own smaller stories in return, moments of unnoticed kindness, the comfort of routines, the strength found in being overlooked, and Lucien received them with a seriousness that made them feel larger than they had ever been before. As the hour turned, the forest sighed, branches shifting as if settling into a new arrangement, and Elena sensed that something had changed without spectacle, that the night had accepted a different ending than the one Ravenfall expected. Lucien did not claim her, did not step across the stones, did not promise resolution by dawn, and the restraint of it felt like safety. Elena remained where she was, present by choice, and understood that the most dangerous thing she had done was not coming to the ridge, but staying long enough to let a cursed story remember how to breathe. The first hint of dawn did not arrive as light, but as a loosening, the forest releasing its grip on the night inch by inch, and Elena more felt the change in the way the air settled against her skin, less watchful now, more permissive. She rose slowly, joints stiff from stillness rather than fear, and Lucien Blackwood mirrored the movement at a respectful distance, his posture open, his attention steady. He spoke of morning as a threshold rather than a deadline, explaining that the curse responded to transitions, to the moments when choices crystallized, and Elena listened, noting how the clearing seemed to expand, as if granting them a few extra feet of understanding. The moon faded into a pale outline above the canopy, replaced by a wash of gray that softened edges and revealed details the dark had kept private, the texture of bark, the careful placement of stones, the calm in Lucien's expression that had nothing to do with surrender. Elena asked what would happen when the pack realized she had not returned, and Lucien answered without bitterness, saying that truth had a way of traveling faster than fear once it found a voice willing to carry it. He explained that Ravenfall had not always been what it was now, that leadership had once been shared, accountable, rooted in service rather than control, and as he spoke Elena recognized the architecture of betrayal, familiar as a childhood home, built slowly, brick by brick, until no one remembered the view it had replaced. She felt a pull then, not a command, but a recognition, the quiet alignment of two paths that had been circling the same center without knowing it, and she steadied herself by naming what she felt without dramatizing it. Curiosity braided with resolve. Lucien acknowledged the shift with a nod, explaining that bonds did not form through force or spectacle, that they emerged when consent met timing, when presence was chosen again and again, and Elena felt relief in the absence of pressure, in the permission to arrive at meaning without being rushed. The forest brightened by degrees, measuring minutes in bird calls and drifting mist, and Elena realized that staying had already changed her, that she no longer felt like an absence waiting to be filled, but a participant shaping the space she occupied. Lucien spoke then of return, not as conquest but as correction, of standing before the pack not to punish but to name what had been broken and invite accountability, and Elena listened, understanding the weight of such a choice, the courage it demanded to face those who had rewritten the past. She offered to walk with him to the ridge, not as shield or symbol, but as witness, and the way he accepted, quietly, and without ceremony, felt like the beginning of something grounded and real. They moved together at an unhurried pace, keeping the stones to their sides rather than behind them, honoring the boundary even as they left it. And Elena noticed how the forest opened a narrow path ahead, light threading the way. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Lucien paused, turning to her with an expression shaped by gratitude rather than claim, and spoke of trust as a practice rather than a prize. Elena met his gaze, steady and unafraid, and answered with a simple agreement, choosing to continue without guarantees. The ridge appeared ahead, a line drawn between old stories and new, and Elena understood that the sacrifice Ravenfall had intended had become a reckoning they could not avoid, not because of power reclaimed, but because two people had chosen presence over fear, and in doing so, had given a cursed history permission to change course. The ridge came into view with the clarity of daylight, not dramatic but honest, and Elena more felt the weight of the world return in familiar measures, the slope ahead marked in yards rather than legends, the air carrying the ordinary sounds of morning waking. Ravenfall lay beyond, roofs catching the first light, paths drawn clean and visible, and Lucien Blackwood slowed his pace to match hers, an unspoken agreement that neither would arrive alone. As they descended, the forest thinned, and with it the quiet that had held them through the night, replaced by the soft murmur of pack life stirring, doors opening, footsteps counting out routines practiced for years. Elena noticed how Lucien carried himself now, not hidden by shadow or bound by caution, but measured and present, his attention outward rather than braced inward, and she sensed the curse respond, loosening not with spectacle, but with consistency, like a knot learning it no longer needed to hold. At the edge of the grounds, Lucien paused, explaining that tradition demanded an announcement, but consent demanded readiness, and Elena appreciated the space he gave her to choose how to stand. She chose the open ground near the central oak, visible without being elevated, and Lucien stepped beside her rather than ahead, a detail that mattered more than words. The pack gathered gradually, curiosity pulling them closer in small groups, whispers traveling faster than feet, and Elena felt the familiar urge to shrink pass through her and leave, replaced by a steadier resolve shaped by the night she had chosen to stay. When Lucien spoke, his voice carried without force, filling the space with clarity rather than command, and he named himself plainly, not as a threat returned but as a leader restored by truth. Faces shifted, recognition flickering into disbelief, then into something like understanding, and Elena watched the moment land, measured in seconds that felt longer than they were. Lucien spoke of history without accusation, of promises made and broken, of fear elevated to law, and he did not ask for submission, only attention, and the quiet that followed felt earned. He acknowledged Elena then, not as an offering but as a witness, and the way he said her name carried respect that did not demand response. Elena felt the pack's gaze settle on her, not sharp now, but searching, and she met it without apology, grounded in the truth of where she had stood and why. She spoke briefly, choosing simplicity over rhetoric, explaining that she had gone to the ridge because she had been sent, and returned because she had chosen, and the honesty of it moved through the crowd like a breath shared. Lucien outlined what would come next, accountability shaped as process rather than punishment, the rebuilding of trust through transparency and shared labor, and the pack listened, some with relief, others with unease, all with the knowledge that the old story no longer fit. Elena sensed a pull then, subtle and mutual, the alignment Lucien had described taking form not as claim but as connection, a bond grounded in consent and timing, and she acknowledged it with a steady breath, neither rushing nor resisting. When Lucien offered partnership, not as decree but as invitation, the moment held, balanced on choice, and Elena accepted with a nod that felt like stepping onto solid ground after a long crossing. The morning continued, ordinary and changed, tasks resuming with new attention, and Elena understood that justice did not arrive as thunder, but as the quiet work of standing where fear once ruled and choosing something better, together. The day unfolded into purpose, and Elena more felt the pack reorganize around the truth that had been named, not hurried but unmistakable, like a river finding a clearer channel. Lucien Blackwood remained beside her as elders convened beneath the oak, their voices steady, their questions practical, and the shift from rumor to responsibility happened in measured steps that respected the weight of change. Lucian addressed the council without spectacle, outlining a path that replaced secrecy with record, fear with shared oversight, and tradition with consent. And Elena noticed how often he paused to invite clarification, how leadership took shape as listening rather than instruction. The curse, long described as an external threat, was reframed as a consequence of broken trust, and the simple honesty of that truth moved through the pack with a quiet relief, giving people language for what they had felt but never named. Elena stood present without being placed on display, her role defined by choice rather than symbolism, and when questions turned to her, she answered plainly, grounding her words in experience rather than accusation. The morning light warmed the clearing by degrees, revealing faces less guarded now, shoulders easing as the future became something that could be planned rather than avoided. Lucian proposed immediate steps that honored accountability without punishment, including open records, rotating stewardship, and a commitment to review any right that required silence from those most affected, and the council agreed, not because they were compelled, but because the alternative had been laid bare. Elena sensed the bond between herself and Lucian settle into something durable, not loud, not consuming, but steady, a mutual alignment that strengthened with each transparent decision. When the elders asked how the pack should address the night that had passed, Lucian answered with restraint, stating that the offering had been refused by consent, and that what remained was a responsibility to repair, not to erase. Elena felt the weight of that choice land, not as burden but as relief, the knowledge that the story would continue without requiring her to disappear. As the assembly dispersed into workgroups, ordinary tasks resumed with new intention, and Elena moved through the grounds accompanied by nods rather than stares, her presence acknowledged without being interrogated. Lucian took time to speak with families who had feared the ridge most, offering clarity rather than comfort, and Elena recognized the patience it took to build trust one conversation at a time. By midday, the pack gathered again, this time to witness a declaration shaped by consensus rather than decree, and Lucian named Elena as his partner in governance, not elevated above others but aligned with him in service, a choice affirmed openly and without pressure. Elena accepted with a steady breath, understanding the responsibility it carried, and the agreement was marked simply, recorded in plain language for anyone to read. The forest at the edge of the grounds seemed to brighten, light threading through branches as if acknowledging a balance restored, and Elena felt the final tension of the curse ease, not shattered but resolved, like a knot untied by patience. As the afternoon settled into routine, Elena understood that justice had arrived not as a moment, but as a method, and that the Alpha King had returned not to reclaim power, but to return accountability to where it belonged, with the people who would now carry it forward together. Evening returned with a gentler cadence, and Elena more felt the day settle into something like belonging, the pack grounds measured now in familiar steps rather than guarded distances, the air carrying the ordinary sounds of shared work coming to rest. As lanterns were lit one by one, spaced a few yards apart along the paths, Lucian Blackwood walked with her beneath the oak where decisions had been recorded in plain ink, and the simplicity of it felt deliberate, a promise that transparency would outlast ceremony. The elders gathered again at dusk, not to debate, but to confirm what had already begun, voices calm, questions answered openly, and when Lucian spoke he did so with clarity that left little room for fear to hide, naming the work ahead as collective and continuous. Elena stood beside him without being positioned, her presence accepted as part of the landscape rather than an exception to it, and she felt the bond between them steady, not demanding attention, simply informing the way they moved together. The forest at the edge of the grounds breathed in the cooling air, branches shifting as if acknowledging a long-held tension finally released, and Elena sensed the last trace of the curse dissolve, not as a dramatic end, but as a quiet resolution, the kind that leaves room for growth. When the pack addressed the night on the ridge, the language had changed, replacing sacrifice with accountability, secrecy with consent, and the words felt lighter for it, easier to carry into tomorrow. Lucian closed the gathering by naming a single standard that would guide them forward, that no rite would proceed without the voice of those it affected, and the agreement that followed was not unanimous by pressure, but complete by choice. As the crowd dispersed, Elena found herself approached by those who had once looked away, apologies offered without expectation, gratitude expressed without obligation, and she received them with the same steadiness that had carried her through the night, understanding that repair was a practice, not a performance. Lucien took time to speak privately with the last of the elders, outlining timelines measured in weeks and months rather than promises made overnight, and Elena appreciated the patience in that approach, the refusal to trade one myth for another. When they finally stepped away from the oak, the sky had darkened into a field of stars, clear and unhurried, and Elena felt the day's meaning settle into her bones, not as triumph, but as alignment. Lucien turned to her then, his expression open, and acknowledged the choice they had made to stand together, naming partnership as responsibility shared rather than power claimed, and Elena answered with a nod that carried certainty without finality, a willingness to continue choosing with eyes open. They walked the grounds once more, checking lanterns, greeting those still awake, and the ordinary care of it felt like a seal more binding than any oath. At the ridge beyond, the forest stood quiet and watchful, no longer a place of exile, but a boundary respected by consent, and Elena understood that the story Ravenfall would tell from this day forward would not erase what came before, but would hold it honestly, learning from the harm rather than hiding it. As the night deepened, Elena felt no need to mark an ending, because what mattered had already taken root, the return not of a feared figure, but of trust, reclaimed through presence, patience, and the courage to listen, and in that quiet certainty, she knew the pack would not offer another life to silence again.